when I entered the having kids phase, I knew it was kind of what I wanted to do, but it was such a scary, unknown territory, and I was very self-conscious about how am I gonna do this okay? And it's been a lot easier for me to say, hey, this is a big adventure going into empty nesting, and let's see how this goes. I was surprised at how emotional my husband was about empty nesting. I'm telling you, the first weekend of empty nesting, it was a train wreck. Dad has a tendency to worry about the children. I worry about the children too, but it's a little different for Dad. It was like all his focus that was on the children, it was like, where are they? Oh, I'm gonna hone in on Kate. And it was a little tricky. It was only a few days of that, of sort of that rockiness. Yeah. And then it turned out we just started having fun. But I do want to say, saying empty nest, I don't actually love that term. So a nest is for the birds that live in it, and then if it's empty, that means somehow this nest is no longer fulfilling its purpose. So what I would really like to popularize is some kind of term that is like successful launcher of birds, successful bird launcher. I worried about my last child, like, oh, but this child needs me. This child needs me all the time. We're gonna need to, Turned out that child did fine. And I thought then I would be sitting around without a sense of purpose. And I don't really have that. My time is full, and I'm absolutely as busy as I would like to be. I would have, and I know I had heard this advice, but for any kind of correction you make with a child or a spouse, you need to have something like 7 or 9 positive build-up moments. And I thought about that some, and I tried to do that some. If I could go back, I might say to my younger self, this is one of the most important things you're ever going to do. And you are going to be happier, and they are going to be happier. Any little thing you see that they do that is positive, you just lay it on as thick as you can, and you just build them up, and you just give them hugs, and you just tell them that they're awesome. I still get to be a mom. So great things about that. I get lots of do-overs, right? So I can lavish that praise on my kids now. Also, as it turns out, guess what? I got kids coming back. So empty nesting, it lasted about 6 months.
Basically, as soon as I moved out here, we started having very serious conversations very quickly about adopting a dog. I moved out at the beginning of April, and we started putting out applications right away. We had heard that over the pandemic it became very, very hard to adopt dogs in Seattle. I think we had this huge fear that we would fall in love with the dog online and put out an application and not actually get the opportunity to adopt them, and this would happen over and over and over. And so we started just, really quickly trying to put out applications. So I moved out at the beginning of April, and by the beginning of May, we had adopted Darwin. So as it turns out, there are a lot of stray dogs, particularly in Texas. I think on the order of millions of stray dogs that are waiting to be adopted. And because there are so many stray dogs, there aren't that many people looking to adopt that don't already have options. The opposite is true in the Pacific Northwest, where there are a lot of people that want to adopt dogs, but there aren't actually that many dogs in shelters. And so there is this one particular adoption agency. She drives down in this big van and picks up a bunch of dogs from Texas and drives them up to Seattle and Portland and other cities in the area. And so luckily, Darwin was one of these dogs as part of this program who we were able to adopt from Texas up here in Seattle. I think choosing a name for Darwin was probably the hardest part of actually adopting him. I started out with the position that it's a name that he's used to, he responds to it, so we shouldn't change it. You had the perspective of, hey, let's just consider if there are any other names we might like. After I got over this fear about causing an identity crisis for our dog by changing his name, we started to brainstorm and decided to think about some names of famous scientists, and we thought Darwin was very cute, and looking at this cute little guy, we thought, maybe this will work. And as soon as we started calling him by that name, I felt 100% comfortable. I felt silly for being so scared to change his name. Ever since, it has felt like it just fits him so well. He's such a curious little lad, very into exploring. He's a little bit of an anxious dog, which on the one hand, I often feel bad when it seems like he's behaving in a way that's anxious, but at the same time, it's often very cute. Whenever we are both gone, as soon as I come home, if I'm the first person to come home, he is so obviously excited to see me when I open the door. He's freaking out, and if he could speak English, I imagine he would say, "Oh my goodness, I'm so glad to see you. I've been waiting for you to come home all day." It's been really sweet getting to, even over the course of just a couple of months, develop such a deep bond where I can come home and know that it's, really brightening his day for me to be there. I unconditionally love our dog. Everyone has some room for improvement, and I think Darwin, also has some room for improvement. Sometimes he does decide that there are things to bark at that I might not choose for him to bark at. I've loved dogs growing up. I grew up with dogs and just have a very positive feeling towards dogs in general. Very positive, yeah, exactly. I would 100% say that he's the most perfect dog in the world.
If you actually know about esotericism, then I'm probably saying this entirely wrong. But if you don't know about esotericism, then just take it from me. I have read a lot of books in my time, many of which I've found to be very interesting, and none of which I've read and thought I really am truly fully committed to this ideology or this philosophy. I wanted to talk a little bit more about empiricism and pragmatic empiricism. I say pragmatic empiricism because focusing on and having an empirical basis for the decisions I make as much as possible has been very reliable. Currently I'm pursuing a PhD in human genetics. We talked about how, as a scientist, our charge is to go to the very edge of human knowledge and reach out into the unknown, use the scientific method to discover something new and useful to better the state of humanity. I see great value in the scientific method, and at the same time, science does not claim to have all of the answers right now. We have to look other places. I've been thinking recently about my own experience on social media. I really enjoy memes that are absurd. I've realized that a lot of times I'll post something that I think is funny, and I really only expect a few people among my followers to understand it. The point is the experience of being mystified and being confused. I've thought about the role that mysticism and esotericism have played previously in humanity, especially up to the Enlightenment era and the modern age of science. The root of esotericism, esoterikos, is a Greek word from, I believe, the 2nd century that is referring to an inner circle. And on social media, we have our literal inner circles, and I think that this experience of wanting to have an intimate group that engages in something absurd or mystical, I think that this has a relation to ancient human social organizations. I think that more than just blowing off steam, it allows me to reset, and I think that it's a really important balance for me internally to embrace and acknowledge that I know that there are probably practically a lot of limitations on what science will be useful for me in my lifetime.
The spatially iterated prisoner's dilemma. It's probably the single idea that I have been most obsessed with in my life. To understand it, you really have to start with the prisoner's dilemma. So imagine a friend has just convinced you to rob a bank with them, but it has gone terribly wrong, you've been apprehended by the police, and now you are sitting in an interrogation room alone. The cops want you to rat out your friend, and if you do, they'll let you go free. But in the back of your mind, you know they're offering the same deal to your friend, and if both of you confess, then you'll both end up in jail for a long time. If you both cooperate, they'll probably pin some lesser charge on you, like breaking and entering. Everybody would be better off if you cooperated, but each of you has a motivation to betray your friend. So we see the prisoner's dilemma show up in lots of real-world scenarios. One of the classic examples is the nuclear arms race. We might agree that the whole world is better off if nobody has nukes, but if anybody's going to have nuclear weapons, like, maybe we want to have some too, right? And so you end up in this sort of race to the bottom because it's difficult to cooperate. This scenario is really simple, which makes it really easy to analyze for game theorists, but there are a couple of things that we can do to make it more realistic to what we see in the real world. For example, when we're interacting with family members or coworkers or neighbors, well, what happens when you play the game again and again with the same person? It might change whether or not you decide to cooperate. So this is what we call the iterated prisoner's dilemma. Iterated is just a fancy word for repeating it again and again. The original prisoner's dilemma also only looks at one relationship, right? Only two people interacting. And in the real world, the way that we interact with other people happens in context. So we might care about how cooperation evolves in a group of people over time, where there's this network where people who are close to you, you interact with a lot, and people who are really far away from you, you may never interact with. And this is what they did in this paper, More Effective Cooperation in the Prisoner's Dilemma. They took a bunch of these agents with different strategies and put them in an arena, and they all played the iterated Prisoner's Dilemma with their neighbors. After a session of playing this game with everyone, you would look around at which of your neighbors did the best, and you would adopt whatever strategy they had chosen. So they actually had this tournament where biologists and economists and computer scientists could submit strategies. And some of them were very simple, like always cooperate or cooperate 70% of the time. But some of them were much more complex, where you looked at the history of your interaction with one partner and made a decision based on that. So there are some pretty obvious results from this experiment. So for example, if you have an arena full of people that always betray, and you put one agent that always cooperates, that agent will die out really quickly. And in fact, you can put any number of cooperators, if they always cooperate. If there are any betrayers in that arena, then the betrayers will always win. So they did in fact have a winning strategy. One of the best strategies, not the best, but one of the best strategies was called tit for tat. And this is a pretty simple strategy that just says, whatever your partner did last turn, do to them this turn. One of the results of this is that if you're in a field of some agents that always cooperate and some agents that always betray, you'll end up mostly cooperating with the cooperators and mostly betraying the betrayers. Part of the fundamental tension is that you as an individual always have a benefit to, in one interaction, to betray another person, but this will end up costing you points compared to a scenario where you're able to foster sort of large-scale cooperation. Tit for tat has one big problem, and it's called the death spiral. So you can imagine if something happens for whatever reason and there is a betrayal, then tit for tat agents, if they're playing against each other, can get stuck in this loop where I'm betraying you because you betrayed me last round, but you're betraying me because I betrayed you last round, and this ends up in this same race to the bottom where we all end up in prison, right? One way that you can get around this is by adding what they call in the paper random forgiveness. So this is, you're mostly tit for tat, but if your opponent betrays you, on the next turn, there is still some probability that you will forgive them and still cooperate with them. This gives you the possibility of breaking out of a death spiral and ending up still in that state of mutual cooperation that's better than mutual betrayal. What I find so compelling about this is that we started with just math, just a table of numbers, and what we end up with looks a lot like a certain kind of moral philosophy. Assume the best in other people. If others are pushing you around, be willing to stand up for yourself, but also be willing to forgive others if they make a mistake. Now, I don't think this is like a totalizing worldview of how you should behave, but I think it's a really good reason to be optimistic that we can learn more about how to be good people. And I think that's really neat.
I've been playing table tennis for about 5 years. It's killing the third ball, so if you have the serve, which is sort of advantage, you want to set it up in a way where you know how they're going to return it, and then you can kill that third ball or that third bounce that's going to come back. And it also makes you better at reading your opponent, because you understand, like, oh, if I put the ball like in the deep right corner, or if I put it down the line, just straight down the middle, then it's going to be different than if I just did it in the left or something, you know. It's pretty intense. We're doing 8 days a week, 25 hours a day. Table tennis is my entire life. I love the sport, obviously, so I need to compete, but it's also my father. He played this guy that I'm going to be playing today, Klaus, and he actually died. Klaus was going for the third ball kill. He just died.
Here's me. Oh, see, he can't even handle that. Jeff who?
Jeff Lifferths.
Never heard of her. I didn't kill him. He was just bad. He's bad at table tennis.
Calling him an athlete is definitely understandable, but I don't think he's a super athlete.
And I am the best. Ever.
I mean, he's good for me when I'm in the game, just because he makes it easy, you know?
When I see him play, he's like T-Rex. He can barely hold the paddle. It will be a mercy killing when we play.
I mean, he calls it topspin, but I feel like it's really, like, underperforming. Because it's like a play on words with, like, underspin, you know?
God is the teacher. Henry is the pupil, and I'm the instrument. And Henry will soon know the truth and be humbled.
It's like old head racket user.
I am young. I am muy fuerte. I will make him hurt.
All right, boys. I want a clean, nice match today.
I told you, he's just bad at ping pong. That's it.
We sort of had, like, pandemic fatigue's not the right word, but In 2009, we had an H1N1, which is kind of a more severe flu outbreak. And there had been SARS and MERS, Ebola. We actually had a whole prep at our hospital. We got suits to take care of Ebola patients. And then lo and behold, we never saw an Ebola patient. And I remember February 2020, we had a medical staff meeting. And I said, several of you have asked me about this outbreak of Chinese pneumonia and how that will impact us. And all this we've been through, SARS, MERS, which obviously never impacted our hospital. We're watching it. I don't think we're going to need to do anything differently right now. And about 2 weeks later, it was hitting in Iran and Italy. And I remember reading the report from a pulmonologist there. And I just like, oh my goodness, this is real. It's not a regional thing. It has moved. It is very contagious. It is very deadly. There was starting to be editorials. We need to pay attention to this. The CDC was starting to do more and more updates. And the CDC, in fact, said hospitals need to start getting ready, again, around the same time. Because SARS and MERS, it was like there's an outbreak in this small area of North Africa, and there were 100 deaths, but it never moved anywhere. And it was like, this is contagious and deadly. And that really got my attention. And so we took an old wing of our hospital and turned it into like an isolation unit that we put air scrubbers in, and we spent a lot of money to do this. This is before we'd seen a single patient. I even had moments where, have we overshot here? There started to be some reports in the Nashville area, and we admitted a couple of people that had odd pneumonias. It was literally the day that the first positive came back, our unit was ready, and we moved the patients from the floor over there. We had someone come over from the nursing home that tested positive, and we called the nursing home and said, hey, this is a big deal. That was on Wednesday, and on Saturday, they called and they said, we have 50 people with a fever. And we looked at our unit that we were very proud of that had 20 beds. Anyway, over a 48-hour period, we got 100 patients from this nursing home. I was basically living at the hospital. I couldn't sleep. I was waiting for the next wave. So mid-March or so, everything starts shutting down. And there was a lot of debate. People were like, is this really any worse than the flu? We're overreacting. A lot of people I was talking to, even in February 2020, were still thinking of it like SARS or MERS. And I think it was just we've got really serious reports from different areas. It's like triangulation of that. This is all coming together to be a serious thing. Again, because things shut down, it actually pretty quickly stopped that initial spread. And so for March, April, May, people were saying, hold on, is this really a thing? Is it serious? Meanwhile, we had just seen 20 people out of 100 die. That has never happened since the 1918 flu. There was no question. This was a big deal. Burnout, PTSD, those things get thrown around a lot. Moral injury. In fact, here we are, December of 2023, really 2 years almost after the last big wave, and we have 13 COVID patients in the hospital. It's like it's kind of taken away the sense of, the denial of security of we're fine. If I wash my hands and I'm healthy, we're in good shape. If something like this comes up, be as data-driven as possible. What's really happening? Where's that information coming from? When the cases are settling down, trust that data too. For a community hospital in some nondescript place, I feel like we did a really good job, and it will be one of the things that when I'm in the nursing home, I look back and I'll be proud of what I did.
So I didn't have the intuition some people say they just knew they were pregnant. I was hoping to be pregnant, and so I was taking pregnancy tests every now and then. And when I got the first pregnancy test, the line was so faint that I could barely see it. I looked it up, and yes, if there's even just a very faint line, it still means you're pregnant. You can't just be a little bit pregnant. You're pregnant or you're not. So I had been planning for a while to tell Jonathan that I was pregnant with a game of spinanagrams. And so I set up the spinanagrams, I recorded his reaction, it was very fun, and then I told him immediately, but the line was very faint. So it's possible that I have been wrong this whole time. I took another pregnancy test again, we looked at it together. The line was much darker. We kind of got to confirm the pregnancy test together. I totally felt like I would wake up one morning and oh no, that was a fluke actually. I couldn't possibly be growing a human inside me, certainly not. I ate a lot of ramen. I would say, I really want to get a milkshake. It's a craving, but it wasn't. It was just I wanted a milkshake. Christmas 2022, it was -4. We were scrambling to move our goats from the pasture into the barn. We got stuck in the field halfway over, and we were so exhausted, and it was getting so cold. The next day, the truck had frozen. In the barn, I had dropped a board with a rusty nail on my foot, and the rusty nail went through my boot into my foot. And the next day, we quickly realized that it was becoming infected. So I was out there for probably 4 to 6 hours with a shovel, whacking with an infected foot,
And being
and
pregnant.
also 3 months pregnant. And we did eventually get the truck out of the ruts. A lot of pregnant women will experience Braxton Hicks contractions, which are kind of like practice contractions through their pregnancy. I didn't have any of those. My water broke and I still wasn't having contractions. And my mom said, well, we should go into the hospital just to check. Yes, my water had broken, but my contractions didn't start until 7 hours later when I was put on Pitocin. I didn't know if I was gonna have to go to a C-section, and that was really difficult because I didn't want to go to a C-section. I wanted to have a natural birth. 24 hours, almost 24 hours after my water had broken initially, and I was just like so tired. I had barely slept, but I came to terms with having a C-section. I decided it's gonna be okay. It's not what I planned, but plenty of women give birth with C-sections. They give birth to healthy babies. They recover okay. After that, I finally started dilating enough that I wasn't gonna have to go to C-section. There's so much uncertainty around pregnancy. So I wish I could go back and tell myself, you are going to have a beautiful, healthy baby, so that I could really let myself get excited for that. It does seem like he is a determined little baby. The farther removed you get from the difficult time, the less you remember the difficulty, and the more that you're like, oh, I could go for another baby. So I'm starting to get to that point where I'm thinking like, oh, this is actually fun. I think I'll do it again.